hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland by releasing hormones into the hypophyseal portal system. These hormones, which are called releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones, kind of like the thyroid-releasing hormone, these hormones, they regulate the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary doesn't do anything unless the hypothalamus tells it to. For example, the hypothalamus releases, and I'm not kidding, this is the name, the growth hormone releasing hormone. And it also releases a growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And these two hormones, they regulate growth hormone secretion by the anterior pituitary. There are other hormones like ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, and these are produced by the anterior pituitary gland as well, including some reproductive hormones called FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, the luteinizing hormone, both which act on gonads. Thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also called TSH, it can also be called thyrotropin. It's produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and it acts upon the follicular cells in the thyroid gland, not the C cells, but the follicular cells. TSH is released in response to TRH from the hypothalamus. And TRH, which is the thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, it stimulates the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary gland. TSH is the one that stimulates the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. And it stimulates those cells of the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4, which together are known as the thyroid hormone. Remember, it's releasing these hormones from the colloid while at the same time the cells of the thyroid gland are making T3 and T4 to replace the T3 and T4 lost from the colloid. TSH also promotes the growth of the thyroid gland itself, ensuring that there are enough follicular cells to generate the T3 and T4 that your systemic tissues require. The thyroid hormone affects every single tissue in your body. This hormone affects all cells that have nuclei and mitochondria, so pretty much all of your cells except for red blood cells. The thyroid hormone and its effects on these items are discussed in another mini lecture. This here is just to really pinpoint TSH, made by the anterior pituitary gland, that targets the thyroid gland. So the secretion of TSH is very tightly controlled by a feedback loop involving the thyroid hormone. And actually, in this feedback loop, the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus also sense the levels of TH, and it uses the levels of TH to determine the levels of TSH and TRH. So this would be a situation where an organ monitors another hormone in order to determine the output of its hormone. So when T3 and T4 levels are sufficient, then TSH is not released. We don't need to do anything. Thyroid hormone's okay. And this is what maintains a balance. But low levels of thyroid hormones stimulate increased TSH. Prolactin is a hormone that is produced by the anterior pituitary gland. Um, Although you see a picture here that's very complicated, actually the release of prolactin is not very complicated. But prolactin is its primary role is to stimulate milk production in the mammary glands after childbirth. And there are many ways to do that stimulation. But during pregnancy, prolactin contributes to the growth and development of the mammary glands in preparation for lactation. So, prolactin is a very important hormone in nursing mothers. The hypothalamus, it secretes dopamine, not enough to really make a difference as a hormone, so it secretes it more as a neurotransmitter. But dopamine being emitted by the hypothalamus, it suppresses prolactin release. And this is what keeps prolactin under control. But during pregnancy and nursing, there are really high levels of estrogen from mom and from the baby and from the suckling reflex of the baby. And so the suckling reflex reduces the dopamine levels and it like releases the prolactin secretion. So milk production itself doesn't directly inhibit prolactin, but if milk isn't removed, like if the baby stops nursing, then prolactin secretion decreases over time. ACTH is released by the anterior pituitary gland in response to the cortico-releasing hormone, which is released by the hypothalamus. Long-term, low-level physical or emotional stress can increase CRH production. The primary target of ACTH is the adrenal cortex, not the chewy inside, not the medulla, but the adrenal cortex. And specifically, ACTH targets the zona fasciculata and the zona reticularis. So we had fasciculata and reticularis. And so ACTH focuses a lot on those glucocorticoids and FSH and LH. So how do we control ACTH? Well, it does actually fluctuate with the time of day, but there is a negative feedback from cortisol that regulates ACTH. So if there's low cortisol, it'll trigger more ACTH to be produced by the anterior pituitary gland. And if there is high cortisol, it'll shut down that cortisol releasing hormone. People find that they do, like I said, they have a natural fluctuation of ACTH, not necessarily like a set or discrete set point. And ACTH levels can peak in the morning and decrease throughout the day, kind of like melatonin. And there are some studies indicating that your ACTH levels can help you in workouts. So knowing when your levels, if you do a better workout when ACTH is released in the morning or when it's not released in the afternoon. There are 2 other mini lectures that discuss cortisol and aldosterone in more detail. For us, there are 2 reproductive hormones, one called FSH, or the follicle stimulating hormone, and one called LH, or the luteinizing hormone. The hypothalamus releases what's called a gonadotropin releasing hormone. GnRH floats through the hypophyseal portal system, as do all of the hypothalamus hormones, and it hits the anterior pituitary gland. And GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary gland to release LH and FSH. And LH and FSH can go to the appropriate follicle or the appropriate gonad, and it can increase the gonad's ability to produce testosterone, which we discuss later in the reproductive section, or estrogen, which again, we discuss later in the reproductive section. FSH in general, FSH prods sperm production or egg production, ovum production, whereas LH is more about controlling a cycle, and therefore LH is more crucial for like ovulation and menses. Growth hormone can also be known as somatotropin, which is a word that better reflects its ability to promote growth in tissues. Well, maybe not. Growth hormone is pretty accurate. Growth hormone secretion is regulated by the hypothalamus in the same way that other anterior pituitary hormones are regulated. The hypothalamus senses that growth hormone levels are low, and it releases a growth hormone releasing hormone into the hypophyseal portal system. GHRH then travels directly to the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate the release of growth hormone into systemic circulation. When growth hormone levels in the blood are high, the hypothalamus releases a growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or GHIH, to stop the release of GH. An interesting note about growth hormone is that an interesting note about growth hormone that is not shared with other hormones of the anterior pituitary gland is the interaction with IGF, or insulin-like growth factor. Growth hormone can make your liver do many of the same things that insulin makes your liver do. And this is what makes growth hormone such a powerful anabolic steroid, is that growth hormone stimulates the release of IGF from the liver, and IGF increases the half-life of growth hormone, preventing it from being cleared from your blood. Disorders of growth hormone include gigantism caused by excess GH, and thought to be what Andre the Giant, great wrestling icon of the 1980s, was afflicted with, but he never sought treatment for it. Pituitary dwarfism, characterized by insufficient GH, is not the same as endochondral dwarfism, which only affects long bones. Pituitary dwarfism results in a proportionately small stature, and is what Vern Troyer, who played Mini-Me in the franchise, the Austin Power franchises in the 1990s. Vern Troyer has pituitary dwarfism. So, growth hormone affects the liver, it affects cartilage, adipose tissue. In adipose tissue, it releases fatty acids to increase energy availability for cellular respiration, muscle growth, and this is a process called gluconeogenesis. In the liver, it stimulates glycogen breakdown, which is a process called glycogenolysis. And that releases glucose into the blood, making it more available to make ATP or to be dedicated to growth. It also promotes skeletal muscle and cartilage growth by increasing myofibrils and supportive structures. To increase energy intake, ghrelin, which I've also heard some people call it ghrelin. I don't know. Dictionary online said either one is acceptable. And this is often called the hunger hormone. And it encourages food consumption, right? Which encourages your energy intake. Meanwhile, there's a glucose sparing effect that redirects your use of energy. So instead of relying on glucose, your body starts to tap into fatty acids stored in adipose tissue as an alternative fuel source. And this conserves the glucose in your blood for critical organs like the brain. This is also the situation that leads to ketoacidosis in diabetics, which which is caused by something very different than the cause that we're talking about here. In the liver, there's glycogenolysis with glycogen being broken down, but it's this glycogenolysis that hopefully helps to maintain a stable blood sugar level for the brain, right? It's this process this glucose sparing process that is sparing the brain at the expense of other organs.